Welcome to the Data Leadership Lessons Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony J. Algeman. Data is everywhere in our businesses, and it takes leadership to make the most of it. We bring you the people, stories, and lessons to help you become a data leader. Today, I'm joined by Garrett Vandendries. Garrett is a public sector leader who has helped public transit, transportation, and city and state agencies around the world improve their business operations. He has done management, data, consulting, policy, and that is just the tip of the iceberg. Garrett, welcome to the show.
Hey, Anthony, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And so why don't we just start? Why don't you take a few minutes to introduce yourself further and kind of talk a little bit about how data plays a role in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting topic. I mean, for me, I think, you all know I'm not somebody who really came from the quote unquote data space in terms of formal training. So years ago, I actually went to school for architecture, and a part of my education, because I had known for a while that I wanted to go in that since I was younger, and I started to focus more on the technical side, which, this is now over 20 years ago. That field was moving more towards from a manual medium to a digital medium. So I started doing a lot of computer-aided drafting and whatnot in high school. So fast forward 7-8 years later, when I was in college and finishing up my degree, I had been working on more sort of technically focused aspects of the field. As some folks were learning the computer stuff, I was really starting to put it into play, and quality of design or whatnot aside, by the time I got into the field, I was focusing a lot more on technology and the design components of it. And it was a rapidly evolving field and emerging field. So that kind of brought me into a lot of 3D modeling, which incorporated a lot of data, a lot of field observation work for some of the planning and transit projects that we were working on at my firm. And I really liked that a lot. I really took very kindly to it, and I thought there was a lot to offer in a way that was making our jobs a lot more efficient and offering a new edge. So I was entering the field right before, ironically, we're kind of on the potential cusp of a recession now, entering the field a couple of years before the recession in 2008. Mm-hmm. And as we saw the field contract, we saw that technology start to come into play a lot more in a lot more impactful way than it had before, because we had to find ways to be more productive with what we had. And, there started to be a lot of emerging trends in how we leverage the information for those computer systems. So years ago at an engineering consulting firm that I worked at, one of the things we did, because I'd done a lot of 3D modeling, was start to standardize libraries of these different blocks that were used in design. So common themes or common items that were used throughout different designs across the country. We were developing this standard library, almost a form of sort of governance for it. And that was just kind of the beginning. Eventually started moving along towards more of the technology side of the design field, working on some fare system technology work, doing an extensive amount of data collection for bus rapid transit, corridor studies, and building management systems, looking at building information design, BIM design, so designing in 3D and all of the data that comes along with that. And it really interested me a lot. So, a few years later, I had an opportunity to focus more specifically on that component of the field when I went to the Chicago Transit Authority to start a data group. And what that really meant, notwithstanding, it was just the idea that the agency recognized that there was a growing importance of the way that information was used and how it was used, and that it was kind of transitioning a little bit from what it had been done before. There were always people using data. It wasn't a new thing. It's just a new sort of iteration of it. And that kind of brought me into something I was really interested in, which was focusing a lot more on how that information was used to improve our cities and improve infrastructure. And that's when you and I crossed paths shortly thereafter, and it's kind of grown from there.
Yeah, and so it was at Chicago Transit Authority that you and I got to know each other. And one of the things that I've studied quite a bit in my career is this notion of how kind of structured frameworks and structured thinking plays a role in the data systems that we create and the way we use data in our organizations, especially at scale. Like, you can't just have a bunch of kind of Wild West, well-intended but uncoordinated data efforts happening, which is what we saw a lot at CTA. There were a bunch of different groups. Each one was using data kind of in their own way. And a lot of times it took Herculean efforts to bring it all together. Those once a month, leadership meetings that they would have open to the public, like creating those PowerPoint decks took somebody like the entire month to do. And that couldn't be a sustainable thing as the pace of data and the amount of throughput of data that we had to process just kept increasing and increasing and increasing, and the amount of demand to be able to use that data continued to increase. So it's really interesting to me when I think about like these kind of structured data paradigms and stuff like that, how a person who is trained as an architect has kind of this natural footing with these kind of structured designs. Do you think that helped you understand it in ways that maybe traditional technologists or traditional like data analysts may not see it? Do you apply those lessons from architecture, in the data space even today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, I think there are a number of ways in which people can contribute to the field. There are a lot of different thought processes that work to great benefit and sometimes to detriment, depending on what you're doing. I found that I was able to really take what I had learned in the design field and apply it to the field in a unique way. You mentioned there were some unsustainable practices, I think, that were going on that we saw, when we were at the authority together. Those were not unlike what were going on in many places, right? So it's certainly not a criticism of them. And what I think the biggest challenge when I had got on board was finding ways to help people understand that it wasn't about stopping those processes. It was about finding ways to just coordinate them and allow them to be better resourced and more collaborative in a sense, and and be a champion really for them, because there's ingenuity happening in pockets, and it's a matter of bringing it all together and just being somebody that can help with the awareness. And to tie that back to your question, when I was taught and when I was educated, and by a lot of people far smarter than I will ever be in the design field, or would have ever been in the design field, it was about looking at what is the overall comprehensive problem we're trying to solve for somebody, and how do all these pieces of information come together. And in the case of design, you're looking at, maybe you're designing a convention center, maybe you're designing someone's home, maybe you're designing a retail store. But you're going to sit down with a client, you're going to sit down with a user, with an end user, and with somebody who's going to inhabit that space at one point, and they're going to say, hey, look, these are all the challenges we have. We need you to help solve it, right? So we need to fit these pieces in a certain way into your home or into your store or into your park or whatever it may be, in a way that makes sense for people, a way that's going to be rational and useful. And you have to be very empathetic about how that's going to play out. And I think for me, that's always something I've been able to use. So whether I'm designing a building or designing, in this case, maybe a data solution, or architecting, helping somebody architect a front end, it's just thinking about what's the end user going to need, how is it going to play out over time, and considering all those things as they come together. That those two thought processes, whether you're talking architecture or designing a software application, they're virtually identical. There's a lot of sort of applicable process there. So.
Yeah, that empathy aspect to it, I think, is so important, because you really, if, like we mentioned, like Chicago Transit Authority was not unique in the fact that they had a bunch of different things going on with data, and they weren't all well coordinated. What we see in a lot of organizations is that sometimes the data governance group will come in and they'll think like, it's our job to rule with an iron fist and tell everybody what they can't do and all of these things. And that is exactly the opposite mentality than what you really need to take and what you learned as an architect. And that is, you need to have empathy. You need to recognize, hey, these people are trying to do good things, and we can help them through coordination, not slow them down. And I think that kind of advocacy, that kind of using the tools that we have in data management to help them do what they're trying to do better, that's the right mentality to have. Not, oh, we've got to clamp down on all of this unsanctioned use. It just isn't productive. Like, all you're going to do is just make things harder for everybody. And sadly, that seems to be the modus operandi of a lot of data governance groups out there. It's like, just because we call it governance doesn't mean you're supposed to tell people not to do everything. That's just not how it works.
Right. Yeah, it's tough, right? Because I think you would say, I think probably better than anybody, you've got to do the right thing at just the right time, right?
Hmm.
Doing just in time governance and recognizing that the concept of implementing governance is, whether it's data or any governance that exists in any sort of sector of the world, but especially in data, it's something that doesn't end. It's not it's not a project. We're not going to end data governance by January of 2022. That's going to be like, you're not.
Yeah.
But the other, on the flip side of that, starting it is equally as difficult, right?
Oh
As
yeah.
try to define it as a project, starting it. So I think something that was really interesting, and that I will forever be grateful because of how much I was able to learn just by having to go through it, was finding the ways to begin that momentum. And there were people who, at the beginning of the work that we were doing, in this case at CTA, who were all on board, who thought this was great. I'm glad
Hmm.
we finally are focusing on that. There were others who said, why are you here? We've done this before, or it's never going to work. It's happened. It didn't work. It just, this has happened 3 times in the past. And,
Yeah.
there's a range of challenges that you're going to start out with anywhere. I think, again, I think what I'm referring to in that personal experience is really no different than what we've seen at other clients, where we're looking at similar topics. But it's a matter of having an opportunity up front to to start fresh. But there's also the challenge of getting people coordinated and getting everyone together. And I think a lot of it just comes back to conversation, right? People so quickly, especially nowadays, want to just jump into using data. And in a lot of ways, we should do that. There's a benefit in that. But I think
Yeah.
recognizing what you're trying to accomplish and recognizing what you may or may not get um, immediately is really important. You know,
Yeah, there's that whole catch-22 right now of you have all of these tools that are accessible by anybody, and
yeah,
some of them are free, and you can come in and do so much, but it's kind of, it drops off quickly when you really want to scale it to something that can impact a larger organization. And it's fine for prototyping things, it's fine for doing some basic analysis, but when you want to try to bring a solution to 1,000 people, it
mhm,
doesn't scale very well. And until you learn some of the kind of foundational techniques of how to build larger scale data systems, you can't just jump from one to the other. And it's a real painful migration for a lot of businesses that have thought that they were on the right track, like they were doing cool stuff, and then they're like, oh wait, now that we've gone from 1 million rows to 1 billion rows, what do you mean I need an entirely different platform to handle that? and
yep,
and that's just, it's just one of those things, like we're constantly trying to get beyond what we already know. Like, and this is true of even an individual, right? Like the stuff you've done before is relatively easy to go do it again. You spend most of your time struggling to learn that new thing that you haven't quite done before. And it's true in an organization as well. It's like, if you can go process some data, you can regurgitate it again, and each month you can go through that same process. But that's not that interesting. That's really just
yeah,
doing work, and really it's pushing the envelope, moving into something that you don't necessarily know the answer to, or that you will be able to have an insight that you didn't have before. That's the stuff that real value comes from. And that's the part where, if you don't have the right kind of mechanics, the right foundations, that the right architecture from a data perspective, in the data space, or in the real physical perspective in the building space,
right,
without proper architecture behind it, you're going to have dysfunction. And sometimes it's going to be very apparent, and sometimes it's not. I'll never forget when my wife and I, this is, oh man, we're pushing 20 years now, we were looking at houses for the first time. And I do not understand how so many houses in a normal, like middle class Chicago suburb, were truly terrifying to actually walk through. Like, one, I'll never forget the dollhouse. They
right,
had a bunch of creepy, like half-life sized dolls in every room. Like, that's what they did. And nobody was like, their real estate agent wasn't like, maybe you should put those in the storage unit when you're showing the house, because they just had them on display, and it was like one room of terror after the other. And my favorite one was the one where you actually had to walk through the bathroom to go downstairs. Like, the door to the basement was actually through the bathroom. And I'm like, somebody did something weird here. And
yep,
I'm no architect, but I know that something is off about this house, and I don't really want to live here. But I think that we see that kind of thing in data all the time. And what's, one of the great universal truths in data and in technology development and business development, that is, nobody wants to document anything. Like, nobody wants to like spend time talking about what you did. You want to go do new stuff. And if it's not logical and it's not easy for somebody to follow, you're constantly losing insight about everything you did to make the things happen that are happening now. And so you end up in this kind of like hamster wheel of trying to go re-engineer things that have been existing forever that nobody really knows how they work. And you just end up with all this noise. And it's really hard to push things forward when you have a whole universe around you that you only understand slivers at a time. It's really a difficult thing that most organizations are dealing with data, because they haven't been thoughtful about a lot of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I mean, that right there is, we could probably talk for hours about this and how it manifests itself. And that is a really, I don't think sensitive is the right word, but it's a really challenging component of public sector work, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a lot, everybody's got their opinion. It's government, it's wasteful. There's always, there's these, standard tropes that get thrown out there. Like, and in some cases, that's true. There is, like many sectors, I mean, there is waste, and on the private side of things, you see it too. Like, we've been doing these things for this way for as long as we have been, and we just keep doing them. Or, you don't have to be in the public sector to buy a tool and not use it effectively.
Mm-hmm.
People do that all the time. But there's a challenge, because there's also from my experience, there's an incredibly resourceful side of the public sector. And there are a lot of people who don't have the tools or the resources that they need, but they have the creativity and the curiosity to find new solutions. And, and from a data perspective, we've seen firsthand, in many places where really ingenious and clever and creative ideas have come out of that response to need, where you're sort of metaphorically, right, backed into a corner. Maybe you're literally backed into a corner, because there's nowhere for you to sit besides there. But you're kind of backed into a corner and saying, hey, look, we don't have the dollars that we need, or we don't have the time that we need, and we have an agency or an enterprise that's running 24/7. We've got to find a solution. Yeah. And in absence of governance, you're still gonna probably get some pretty clever ideas and some really, really effective things. The challenge is applying them in a way that is beneficial for not only the architect, if you will, but the people using it. Mm-hmm. And then capturing that over time in a way, if there's inevitable change, or there's a grow need, like God forbid we build becomes really useful, and suddenly there's a lot of pressure to keep it going. But you've gotten to the point where, to go back to the house analogy, you've probably put too many boards up, and you can't go back. You just got to keep building. And you can't do that forever, right? You have to at some point be able to stop, and it's really difficult to slow that momentum. And that's where having the right balance, I think, of governance comes into play, right? It's okay. We don't want to come in until we can't tell you from the get-go exactly how it's all going to work. That's foolish. This isn't a waterfall environment where we're going to pretend like we know everything, and we're going to schedule it out, and it's all going to happen perfectly. But we also can't just start hammering nails and see what happens, right? Maybe there are some, unique cases where that might be a good way to go, but for the most part, it's a balance. And, like you were saying, why do I have to walk through the bathroom to go downstairs? At some point that might have made sense, right? There may have been a reason why they said, well, hey, you know what? The other side of this is you don't ever go downstairs, but we need to go down there. So you're going to have to walk to the bathroom. But okay, how do we do construction on the bathroom and still allow you to get downstairs, and then make sure that in the future we don't have any more bathrooms built in the hallway, or however, I don't know if that metaphor is still working, but I think you get where I'm going. It's a challenge. It's a challenge, and it's definitely a challenge when you're resource constrained in the public sector.
Yeah, and I want to make mention for benefit of folks that have never worked in the public sector, and I feel like I moonlighted in the public sector for a short period of time. You've spent a lot more time in the public sector, but also in the private sector, you've done a lot of work as well. One thing, so when I went in to do some work first as a consultant in the public sector, and then as a chief data officer at CTA, I was bringing with me all of the stereotypes of what it's like to work in the public sector and what have you. And to some extent, there's some truth in some of those stereotypes. We'll leave that for what it is. But what was astounding to me was a couple things. One is that there are some people that are way talented and do it because they know they matter, that they're helping real people in real cities do real things with
Yep.
whatever their talent is, and they're happy, willing to leave some dollars on the table to do work that actually matters. And it's a nice blend between a non-for-profit and a full-profit enterprise. Like, you can get paid okay, probably not what you're worth, but you can do something that actually impacts real people. And thank goodness there's some people that will do that for their careers, because otherwise those agencies would not go well. And it is a very stressful place to be, because if you wanted to know, and I'll never forget, I would turn on the radio in the morning to find out how my day was going to go, because that's what it was in the news every day. There's something with CTA. At minimum, we're getting, oh, there's a stoppage on the red line due to police activity or something or other. But sometimes it was way bigger than that, and it's just became part of the norm. And unless you've actually worked in an environment where those kinds of visibility and at the same time the kinds of, for lack of a better term, hamstringing you have and being able to get things done in the public sector, you don't get to just sign contracts and do things like that. You have to do RFPs. You have to go through all these hoops to spend any money. And they are well-intended policies that limit what you can do in the public sector. The problem is that though they are well-intended, sometimes they are executed in ways that have unintended consequences. And that's the problem with a lot of the policies that are in the public sector, is that they meant well when they set that policy, but what it results in could be something that's way more expensive or way slower or way more difficult to work with the best provider because of all of the other restrictions. And it's a give and take, and it's never going to be perfect, but I just hope that people listening to this, if you remember nothing else, just remember that there are some really talented people in the public sector, and they will get no thanks ever for what they're doing.
Yeah, I always said, one of the things that drew me to going to work for a public sector agency was like just a really intense curiosity to figure out how it all happens on a given day. And I'm a, not only am I an employee, or was I an employee there, but also just a citizen of the city, and someone who has interest in it working. And you think a lot of people, I think you'll go there and you'll find these answers out, and then it'll make sense. And the longer I was there, the more astonished I was that it actually worked. I feel like the longer I was there, the less I knew, and for good reason. It's complex, it's tough. There's policy in place that is well intended, and it's adhered to, and it has benefit when used properly. Yeah. And I think the easy thing is always to bash on the policy. It's something that people thought, well, we can't do that because we have to go through this process. Well, if we all work within that constraint, you can still be clever with how stuff plays out, and you can still be thoughtful about it. And you have to be patient. You have to focus on what is the overall end goal. Like you said, people really want to do good, and I think when you have a focus that what you're doing means something to your city, and if that connects with what motivates you, you can do some really powerful stuff. And that's where, to bring it back to governance, that's where having a thoughtful way to govern your information and your processes can be really beneficial. We have to look at any place that goes through FAR compliant, FAR compliant procurement processes. You have to be looking at, okay, what limitations are we going to have? If you don't have, imagine someone tells you get to start you're starting a new business, but you can only pick from software, or from technologies, or from services that are offered to you by the lowest bidder, mm-hmm. or by a person who meets a company that meets the combination of cost and availability. And you have all these different sort of stipulations on what you're allowed to do. You can't just go and buy anything. You can't go to the store and pick up a copy of Tableau. You can't go online and just download and fire up 100 servers on AWS and start running a warehouse. You can't do that.
Right.
There are ways to get it done, and it may not be exactly what you went in thinking it was going to be, but you have to be able to adapt to it. So that's where having really strong governance comes into play, because it forces you to look at, what are we trying to accomplish? What do we need to meet that goal? And instead of trying to design from the get-go, you're starting to think more about the end product and then allow the design to be responsive to that. And that way, when you go through a procurement, for example, you can better navigate the fact that you might not be able to totally control that the vendor that gets selected uses Microsoft versus Oracle
Mm-hmm.
as their database framework. You have to be prepared for that, right? So you have to think about how do you construct some of your specifications and some of your RFP documents to say this is what we're looking for, here's what we're trying to accomplish, because folks are going to respond to that. And you can apply that same concept internally when you're working with data, when you're working with your different departments, right? If you're working between finance and operations, you still, as a data practitioner, have to be able to articulate, here's what we're trying to accomplish, here's the vision, and the means through which we want to accomplish it. Now let's talk about what solution will help us get to that end goal.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But you would have to, I'm going to ask you if you agree, though, that because we have to do in the public sector, we have to do this extra level of work to find a middle ground. And granted, we need to be good fiduciary agents of the taxpayers or the fair system, users' financial resources from the money. We've got to do right by that, but it feels like there are so many things that we can't do to be the agents of that in the most efficient way possible. Doesn't it feel like we're adding a layer of governance that makes things harder, but maybe necessary? And that's, I think your argument is that maybe that additional layer is worth that cost and that hindrance. But I also want to think about what happens when we don't have the luxury of time, or we don't, or we have shocks to the system. Because right now we're very obviously going through the coronavirus crisis, and that has had a, put it mildly, catastrophic impact on public transit systems already. And there wasn't margin in that. There wasn't a safety net in what we're learning, pretty much any business out there, but certainly in our public sector agencies, we're having the same kind of struggles, and now there's no buffer there anymore. And so what are your thoughts on this? We've been operating in an admittedly inefficient way for good reason, but still inefficient. Now that we're dealing with a crisis, is it even worth it? Like, have we gone down the wrong path, or is this going to help us in the end? I'm trying to figure this out myself,
Yeah, well, so there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, I think, to some of the earlier comments that you had made, I do think I don't really know that the processes and the policy that are in place are inherently bad. And I don't think that they always by rule will inhibit your ability to get stuff done, right? I think for every inefficiency that's built into those layers and challenges that's built into those layers, there are a lot of jobs behind it, right? There are a lot of people that are able to think and help design and maintain that policy.
Sure.
That's always a huge component of it, right? You have a lot of people employed being able to adhere to that and being able to think through it. And I think that I've never run into a situation where the policy prevented you from getting what you needed. I think especially challenging nowadays, we have everything at our fingertips, right? We can go and, you don't have enough CPU? Great. Fire up 10 more EC2 clusters and set them to dynamic scaling, and boom, you can respond to whatever you need. 10 million people are trying to sign up and buy toilet paper from you because there's a crisis. Great. We'll have enough bandwidth to meet the site users on that day. We're so used to that, especially nowadays, that when we have to step back and think, how we're going to accomplish something, that policy can be beneficial. And I think it's actually getting more beneficial, not less. It doesn't make it necessarily easier to get things done. But I'll tell you this, there have been a lot of things where that process, that effort has really been a self-vetting of whether or not what we need to do is as valuable as we thought it was to begin with.
Yeah.
And the wherewithal that it takes to sometimes get through finding a creative solution and working within those constraints, it really makes you evaluate what you've got and what you're trying to accomplish and whether or not it's feasible and whether or not it's responsible to do. And I think that that leads to a lot of conversations, which is a lot of time spent talking about stuff. But there can be benefit in that. And I think it's just a matter of finding, there's always a way to get stuff done. It's just a matter of getting people rallied together. And the best on the public sector side of things, I think the people that are able to really accomplish that stuff are the ones that know which battles to fight, and that understand that it's really about the long game. That you have to be thinking, more comprehensively about the solution, because it's the only way that it'll get done. And it's tough. You get into times like today, right? To back to the coronavirus impacts we're having,
Yeah.
and there's we live in, I think, depending on how you slice it up, I think there might only be two, maybe three public transit systems in the world that are truly profitable, quote unquote, in the more traditional sense.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's subsidized everywhere. So in some ways, there's less of a concern. Obviously, we need tax revenue, we need local revenue, we need a federal, level of revenue as well in order to maintain capital funding and maintain operating funding. It's going to be a huge challenge. It's been a challenge. But I think when you get to times like now, you start to see, transportation is critical for these cities to exist. And you're telling people to shut down. You still have, you have major drop offs across the board. I mean, it varies from place to place, but many major cities are seeing 80 to 90%, year over year drops right now in their rail ridership, which in many cases tends to be a little bit more discretionary, not by rule. But then in bus ridership, just because the city shut down doesn't mean people have cars that they, didn't have before. They still need to get places. First responders still need to get to work. People still need to get to our hospitals.
Yeah.
Maybe driving a car is an option for some people. It's not for everybody. And it may not solve the problem, and it may compound it. And I think that's how you're going to see transit emerge from this. It's still essential. It's still going to be a critical lifeline for people who need to get around, who need to, and this pandemic is unprecedented on so many levels.
Yeah.
It's very leveling. It's very liberating, I think, for a lot of people, right? This isn't only impacting finance. And it's not only the haves, if you will, that are able to continue doing their job. I mean, we need people who do, minimum wage jobs, and what are jobs that are taken for granted by the cities on a given day. They still need to be able to get to work.
Yeah.
And those buses and train systems allow it to happen. And they're going to for a while. How do we emerge from this? I think, transportation is really going to see some changes probably in the future. I don't think we have any clue as to what that's going to be, but I think we all are. I think every sector is going to see it. People are going to start to evaluate, do we really need to have everybody in person every time for every meeting? Do we need to have everybody flying around constantly? This isn't just a week off, right? This is maybe a month, maybe 2 months. We don't really know at this point how long it's going to take, and it's going to change patterns of business in so many ways. But I think you're going to see transit will reemerge. I mean, if people still have to go to do work, they're going to have to get there somehow. And you still can't, unfortunately, you can't put 100 people in a car yet. You got to put them on a bus. You can't put 800 people in even a fraction of the same space as you can put a train car. And that's just going to be an efficiency that's always there. As long as that many people need to move around, it's still going to be the best way to do it. And I think that's why you'll see it return, hopefully strongly, once this all ends.
Yeah, well, I mean, I remember when we were working together, 2015, 2016, the concern was, is Uber and Lyft, the ride shares, are they going to put us out of business? Like, are they going to completely make the bus and train systems irrelevant? And I think from this, what we're learning in this pandemic is, no, the buses and trains are kind of critical infrastructure that has to be there and can be controlled in a safe way that provides an essential good, an essential need, essential service to the cities and populations out there that there isn't a good substitute for. And I think that this is a big reminder that that's going to be the case. Now, I think we're going to see a slow slog back to the ridership levels that we had 2 months ago. But I think that out of necessity that's going to need to happen. And I think hopefully, we'll learn, hey, we need to invest in our rail infrastructure and some of the kind of crumbling assets that we have in transportation kind of across the board, whether we're talking roads or bridges or, the bus systems themselves. I think there's a lot we can do there, and it'll be part of the solution for a long time to come. I think that's, certainly in my mind. I was wondering if the bus system was going to be there in 10 years. I no longer doubt that. I think the bus system is going to be around for quite a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. And I mean, the if you're a relativist, then times like these are very interesting, right? Because it's there's a really interesting conversation going. Maybe conversation is overstating it, but I know that there are challenges and decisions to be made right now by public transportation agencies, for example, about how to handle the service that they do run, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's an inherent sort of conflict of, okay, well, there's less people riding. We have these really fancy data and technology systems that tell us where our buses are at and where our trains are at, and at what time and what other levels of utilization. And we can look at all this information and start to figure out how is use changed by this sort of external, really unprecedented sort of scenario that we're in. Mm-hmm. And you say, okay, well, we can do really one of two things. There's kind of two sort of worlds emerging right now. One is deter mobility to keep people from crowding and going to places where they shouldn't. So I know, for example, there was a story I was reading the other day about down in DC. They had to go through great extents to keep people from going and seeing the cherry blossoms because people were still trying to go and see cherry blossoms. So one way to do that is to get on a train and go there.
Yeah.
Another way is to drive. So they have, police trying to keep that down. But I know that the transit system also took a role in that by saying, okay, we're not going to stop at the stations that are nearby because we don't want to encourage people being there, which is completely reasonable. I think there's another end of the spectrum, cherry blossoms aside, where, whether it's here or wherever, and if it's in Chicago where I'm at, or if it's in New York, you have to say, okay, do we adjust down our service levels to account for less people, or do we keep them high because the more service that we have, the more we're spreading out riders, right? The more you're keeping people from crowding and waiting together on platforms for that one train to come every 20 minutes. So there's no perfect answer. There's no perfect answer for transit. There's no perfect answer for a lot of sectors right now. But that's one conflict that's going on. But I think you're going to see that it's still going to be there afterwards. We're until everybody moves out of the city or until jobs don't all exist in a location. People are going to need to get around, and even then, they're still going to need to get around, right? Unless you can figure out a way for every human to work from home, which isn't going to happen. Then it's going to be there, and it's just a matter of this is what this time is probably, in my opinion, going to do is really help us look back and reevaluate what's most important to our city. And it's from a transportation perspective, and it's going to impact policy for a long time. It's always going to be something that's in the back of our minds, and it's going to be really fascinating, I think, to see how it all plays out. But I'm very confident that the buses and trains are still going to be there, and that they should be there because people need them. And it's always going to be the most efficient, the most cost-effective way to get through traffic. And that's evidenced in the numbers. And so,
yeah. Well, it makes me think, one of the fundamental reasons that we have data, I often say data is the closest thing to truth that we have in our organizations. And one of the core roles of data governance is to provide a transparent view into that truth, and recognizing that all truth has perspective too. All truth has some inherent bias, but our goal is to try to minimize that. First, understand it, and then minimize that as much as possible so we can get at the heart of what's real. And I think that it's going to be especially important as we do come out of this coronavirus crisis, that we look back and we look forward with data to truly guide what we're doing. And what scares me is knowing the power of data to be transparent. I also know the power of data to be misused to support some ulterior objective, or to just find that confirmation bias in the data based on something that you have preconceived. And it's become so difficult sometimes to wade through all of that. I think that as data practitioners, whether public sector, private sector, in our personal lives, wherever, we want to try to promote that truth view of what data is, as opposed to data being used as a weapon of convincing people of a point. Most of the time there's conflicts, most of the time there's noise in the data sets, and we need to figure out from that data those kinds of answers like you were just talking about. Like, do we solve for the most efficient use of the systems themselves, or do we solve for something like, let's make sure people aren't right on top of each other all the time? That may not be in the short term the most cost effective way, which seems to be the default way we do things in for the past 20 something years, but it may be what we need to do going forward. So I think it's going to be a really interesting time as we overlay policy and like the things that you've been doing in your career. I have to imagine this is a fascinating time as a professional, though obviously the circumstances haven't been ones that you would prefer to have.
Yeah, it's definitely not the way you would want things to play out. I think that goes without saying, but it's a matter of, okay, well, we have this. Let's deal with what we can, and given that today, I back on the private side, if you will, the public sector. I really do miss the opportunity to be in those day-to-day conversations that we used to have at a senior leadership level, and just figure out how are we going to respond to this challenge today.
Yeah.
And right now, this is unprecedented, which is just it's a superlative that is being used across the board. These platitudes of like, we never thought it would get to this point, and it has.
Yeah.
And it's probably only going to get more challenging, at least here for the next several weeks. We have to think, at least conservatively, it's going to be pretty impactful. But one thing I can't help but think about is, this is we have a really unique opportunity to look at our system and look at the data and look at the utilization and tie it back to the human element. In theory, the use we have right now is the most critical, life critical use in our system that we have. I mean, I don't want to assert any plans. I have no sort of insider knowledge, if you will, about this, but you have to wonder, do we start to figure out, how do we prioritize what's going on now, and how do we make sure that these systems and this infrastructure is in place for the future, right? How do we prepare for, God forbid this happens again? How do we prepare for it? Well, we now know where our first responders, not where, but we know that the use of the system is primarily from first responders, from essential jobs, from people helping us get our food, from people helping us, be at doctor's appointments and at hospitals, and for, providing safety to our communities. In theory, the majority of what we're seeing on these systems right now around the country are reflective of that. I have to imagine there are a lot of folks sitting back and saying, hey, let's take a look at this very, very, very uniquely unprecedented scenario that we've found ourselves in, and figure out, how is this part of our strategic planning moving forward? And what can we do to make sure that our policy reflects our ability to support that? And where have we failed, right? I mean, I think you and I both are usually the first to talk about this, right? Like, let's fail 5 times and succeed once, as long as we're doing it thoughtfully and carefully, and that we understand why we're trying to attempt something new. We're going to get something valuable out of it. So right now, I mean, this is a time when let's look at what's happening, what's working, and what's not, and figure out how do we make sure it doesn't happen in the future. Because as we've all seen, you just can't be prepared enough, right? You really can't.
Yeah. Well, I think, as far as leadership lessons go, I think that's a pretty solid one. And with that, we're just about out of time. Garrett, I want to thank you for joining me today and sharing your wisdom. I hope we'll have you back on the show again. I feel like we've just scratched the surface of what we could be talking about. So definitely would like to have you back. Any closing thoughts, anything else you want to say before we call it a show?
No, first of all, thanks for having me on. I'd love to come back at some point. I know there's a lot we can talk about, but I do think that, one thing that I would say is don't ever, don't judge a book by its cover, if you will. don't ever doubt your ability to contribute, right? I'm doing something that I never would have. If you would have told me I'd be doing what I'm doing now 15 years ago, I would have laughed at you. And you may be able to say the same thing. So I think the biggest thing that this field has taught me, and even in the years that I've been doing more strictly data related work tied to it, is that it's evolving, and as humans we have to evolve, just like we're going to right now with this pandemic. Just like we did to get to this point with the technology that we're using. It's all about an evolution. I fully expect that next time you and I talk, the story is going to be very different, whether that's 3 months from now or 3 years from now. So it's an evolution, and I'm happy to be a part of it, and I'm really interested to see where it goes next.
Great. Well, Garrett, thank you again for being on the show, and thank you, all of you out there, for watching or listening today. Please remember to follow, subscribe, like, rate, and leave a review of our show on YouTube and all the major podcast platforms. You can find information about supporting the show directly and how to get a signed copy of my data leadership book at patreon.com/data leadership lessons. Visit algman.com to learn more about Algman data leadership and the many ways we can help you become a data leader. Stay safe during these unusual times and go make an impact.